The last two cards lay face down on the scarred pine table, slick with condensation from sweating glasses of whiskey. A king of spades and a 10 of clubs. That's what Caleb Hayes held. A decent hand, but not a sure thing. Across from him, Frank Bishop smiled, a tight, predatory motion that didn't reach his eyes. The air in the Harmony Creek saloon was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and the kind of cheap cigar smoke that clung to a man's clothes for days. The pot was heavy with coin, a few crumpled bills, and a deed to a played-out silver claim that everyone knew was worthless. But that wasn't what had silenced the room. Standing against the far wall, motionless as a statue, was the rest of the wager. A young Chinese woman in a plain red dress. She was maybe 18, her black hair pulled back neatly, her hands clasped in front of her. She stared at a spot on the floor, her expression a careful, unreadable blank. Bishop had called her his house girl, a debt paid to him by some poor soul in San Francisco. He'd put her in the pot like she was a sack of flour. Caleb shouldn't have been in this game. He was a rancher, not a gambler. His hands were calloused from mending fences and calming horses, not from dealing cards. But the loneliness of his small spread, tucked away in the shadow of the Sierra Nevadas, had become a physical ache. He'd come to town for supplies and stayed for a drink. One drink had become 3, and the easy talk had pulled him into Bishop's high-stakes game. Now he was in over his head, with the whole town watching. "Well, Hayes?" Bishop's voice was smooth, oiled. He was a railroad man, important and accustomed to getting his way. "You in, or you folding like your last crop of hay?" A few men snickered. Caleb's gaze flickered to the woman. Her stillness was profound. It wasn't the stillness of fear, he realized, but of immense control. In a room full of loud, shifting men, she was the only fixed point. Something in her posture, a quiet dignity that had no business being in a place like this, made him push his last stack of chips forward. It was a fool's move, he knew it, but the thought of leaving her to Bishop's cruel mercies was worse than the thought of walking away broke. He turned his cards. 2 pair, kings and 10s. A collective breath was drawn in the room. Bishop's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He turned his own cards over with a flourish that fell flat. A pair of jacks, nothing more. Silence. Then one of Bishop's cronies let out a low whistle. Caleb had won. He had won the money, the worthless deed, and the girl. A cold dread washed over him, far heavier than any elation. He looked from the pile of winnings to the woman in the red dress. Her eyes finally lifted and met his. There was no gratitude in them, no fear, just a deep, unnerving watchfulness. Bishop stood, kicking his chair back. "Enjoy your prize, rancher," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Some things are more trouble than they're worth." He stormed out of the saloon, his men trailing behind him like vultures. The room slowly came back to life, but the mood had soured. Men who had been clapping Caleb on the back a moment before now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He had crossed a line. He had won a person. Caleb gathered the coins and bills, his hands shaking slightly. He left the deed on the table. He walked over to the young woman, stopping a few feet away. He didn't know what to say. There were no words for this. He was a simple man. He knew horses and cattle and the turn of the seasons. He knew nothing of this. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough. He gestured toward the door. "Come on." She didn't move. She just watched him, her dark eyes searching his face. He saw a flicker of something then, a deep weariness that went bone deep. He softened his voice, trying to strip the command from it. "Please," he said. It was the only other word he could think of. After a long moment, She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She walked toward the door, her steps measured and silent. She did not walk behind him like a servant, nor ahead of him, but beside him, her head held high. As they stepped out into the dusty street, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows, Caleb felt the weight of every eye in town on his back. He had never felt more alone. The ride back to his ranch was silent. The wagon creaked and groaned over the rutted track, the two sturdy horses pulling at a steady pace. The sun bled out of the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and bruised purple. Caleb kept his eyes on the road ahead, his knuckles white on the reins. Beside him, the young woman sat perfectly straight on the hard wooden bench. She hadn't said a word since they left town. Caleb didn't even know her name. He had tried once. "I'm Caleb Hayes," he'd offered, the words sounding clumsy in the vast quiet. She had only looked at him, her expression unchanging. He figured she didn't speak English, or maybe she just had nothing to say to the man who'd won her like a new saddle. He couldn't blame her. His ranch was little more than a cabin, a barn, and a few corrals nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it. It was modest, but it was his. He'd built it with his own 2 hands on a homestead claim. As they pulled up in front of the small clapboard cabin, the horses nickered softly, glad to be home. He hopped down and came around to her side of the wagon. He held up a hand to help her down, but she ignored it, sliding off the bench with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in her stiff, formal dress. He led her to the cabin door and pushed it open. It was a single room, clean but sparse. A bed in one corner, a stone hearth for cooking, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding tins and sacks of flour. He'd built a small loft for storage, accessible by a simple ladder. You can take the bed," he said, gesturing. "I'll sleep in the barn. Or up there," he pointed to the loft. She looked around the room, her gaze taking in every detail. She walked over to the hearth, ran a finger along the cool stone, then turned to face him. She gave a slight bow, her hands pressed together. It wasn't a bow of subservience. It was one of formal acknowledgement, like a greeting between equals. Then she walked to the bed, sat on the edge, and folded her hands in her lap, her back ramrod straight. She looked like she was prepared to sit there all night. Caleb sighed. He didn't know what else to do. He brought in a bucket of fresh water from the pump and set it on a small washstand. He put a plate of cold biscuits and jerky on the table. He laid a clean blanket at the foot of the bed. "Good night," he said to her still back. He climbed the ladder to the loft, pulled down a spare bedroll, and carried it out to the barn. As he settled into the hay, the familiar scent of horses and leather a small comfort, he stared out the open barn door at the star-dusted sky. He had wanted to cure his loneliness, but all he had done was invite a different, more complicated kind of solitude into his home. The next few days passed in a strange, silent routine. Caleb would rise before dawn, do his chores, and leave a plate of food on the cabin table before heading out to check his fences or his small herd of cattle. When he returned at midday, the plate would be empty and washed, set back exactly where he'd left it. He'd see her sometimes, walking by the creek, her red dress a startling slash of color against the greens and browns of the valley. She never strayed far. She was quiet and unobtrusive, but her presence filled the small space of his life completely. A week after the poker game, Caleb knew he had to go back to town for supplies. He was low on flour and coffee, and his horses needed shoeing. He dreaded it. He knew Bishop would be there, waiting. He saddled his horse, a steady bay named Buck, and rode out, leaving the young woman standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching him go. Harmony Creek was just as he'd left it, dusty and tense. As he tied Buck to the rail in front of the general store, he saw Bishop and 2 of his men leaning against the assayer's office across the street. Bishop saw him and pushed himself off the wall, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face. "Well, if it isn't the lucky rancher," Bishop called out, his voice carrying across the street. "How's your new property settling in? Keeping you warm at night?" His men laughed. Caleb ignored them, his jaw tight, and pushed through the doors of the store. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, was behind the counter. He looked up when Caleb entered, and his friendly expression immediately vanished. "Caleb," he said, his tone cool. He started polishing the counter with a rag that was already clean. "Abernathy," Caleb nodded. "Need a sack of flour, pound of coffee, and some horseshoe nails." Abernathy stopped polishing. He looked past Caleb, out the window toward Bishop. "Sorry, Caleb. Can't help you today. I'm waiting on a freight wagon, short on stock." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Sacks of flour were stacked high against the back wall. Caleb could smell the rich scent of coffee beans in a barrel right by the counter. "You've got plenty of flour right there," Caleb said, his voice low and even. "Like I said," Abernathy repeated, not meeting his eye. "That's spoken for. Can't sell it to you." The message was clear. Bishop had gotten to him. The town was closing ranks. Caleb was being shut out. He stood there for a long moment, the humiliation a hot brand on his neck. He turned without another word and walked out of the store. Bishop was still watching, his smile wider now. Caleb untied Buck, his movements stiff with anger. He knew he couldn't stay. There was nothing for him here today. As he swung into the saddle, he felt a profound sense of isolation. It wasn't just him against Bishop anymore. It was him against the whole town. He rode out of Harmony Creek with his saddlebags empty and a cold knot of fury in his gut. What he found when he got back to the ranch would change everything. He rode hard, the anger pushing him on. When he crested the last rise and saw his small valley spread out below, a sense of relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Something was wrong. One of his horses, a young mare named Daisy, was limping badly in the corral, favoring her right foreleg. He dismounted before Buck even came to a full stop and vaulted the fence. Daisy's leg was a mess. A deep, wicked gash ran from her knee to her fetlock, torn open on a loose strand of barbed wire he'd meant to fix. The wound was swollen, angry-looking, and already beginning to fester in the summer heat. His heart sank. A horse with a ruined leg was a death sentence out here. He led the mare gently into the barn. His mind raced. He had to clean it, cauterize it. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey and a clean rag from his saddlebags. He'd have to build up the fire, get one of the branding irons hot. It would be brutal, for him and the horse. As he was laying out his crude medical supplies on a crate, a shadow fell across the doorway. The young woman stood there, her red dress immaculate. She looked at the horse, then at the whiskey and the branding iron in Caleb's hands. Her brow furrowed. She stepped into the barn and walked slowly toward the frightened mare. She made a soft, crooning sound in her throat, a sound Caleb had never heard before. Daisy, who had been tossing her head in pain, quieted. The woman reached out a hand and laid it gently on the horse's neck, stroking her with a slow, steady rhythm. Then she turned to Caleb and shook her head, a small, firm gesture. She pointed at the branding iron and shook her head again. She held up her hands, then pointed toward the creek. Caleb hesitated. "I have to close the wound," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words. "It's infected." She ignored him. She left the barn and walked toward the creek bed. Caleb watched her go, a mix of frustration and curiosity warring within him. He couldn't just let her, gather weeds? But the thought of putting a hot iron to Daisy's flesh made him sick. He decided to wait. She returned 20 minutes later, her hands full of broad green leaves and some kind of moss he didn't recognize. She also carried a piece of clean cloth he realized was a strip torn from her own petticoat. She knelt by the water bucket and began to crush the leaves with a smooth stone. mixing them with a little water until she had a thick, dark green poultice. She approached the horse again, speaking that same low, soothing murmur. Daisy stood still for her, trusting in a way that amazed Caleb. With delicate, sure fingers, the woman began to clean the wound with a wet rag, her touch firm but gentle. Then she carefully packed the gash with the herbal paste. Finally, she wrapped the entire leg in the strip of cloth, tying it off with a knot that was both simple and secure. Throughout the entire process, her focus was absolute. Her hands, which he'd only ever seen clasped in her lap, were deft and capable. She moved with an economy and a purpose that spoke of long practice. When she was finished, she stood and looked at Caleb. She pointed to the poultice, then held up 2 fingers and pointed to the rising sun. She repeated the gesture. 2 days. He understood. She wanted him to leave it for 2 days. He looked from her calm face to the now quiet horse. He had been ready to use fire and whiskey. She had used knowledge and patience. In that moment, his perception of her shifted completely. She wasn't a prize. She wasn't a victim. She was a person of deep and surprising skill. And he realized with a jolt that Frank Bishop hadn't just lost a poker game. He had lost something far more valuable, and he was the only one in the room too foolish to see it. Caleb knew then that Bishop wouldn't let it go. This was no longer about a lost bet. It was about his ranch, his water, and the quiet, capable woman who was now under his protection. 2 days later, just as she had indicated, she unwrapped the mare's leg. The swelling was down, the angry redness gone. The wound was clean and already beginning to knit together. Caleb stared, dumbfounded. He had seen injuries like that turn deadly in a matter of days. Her simple poultice had worked better than any rough medicine he knew. That evening, a new kind of quiet settled between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of people who had weathered something together. She was sitting at the table, mending a tear in his work shirt with thread she had unraveled from a sack. Her stitches were small and perfect. Caleb took down a small, worn book from the shelf. It was a simple dictionary, one his mother had used to teach him to read. He opened it and carried it to the table. He set it down in front of her. She looked up, her needle pausing in mid-air. He pointed to himself. "Caleb," he said, clearly. Then he pointed to her. Her eyes searched his for a moment. Then she looked down at her own chest and spoke a single, soft word. "May." Caleb smiled. A real smile, the first one in weeks. "May," he repeated. It was a beautiful name. He opened the dictionary. He slowly thumbed through the pages, looking for a way to bridge the chasm between them. He found the word horse and pointed to it, then gestured toward the barn. She nodded, a small smile touching her own lips for the first time. He pointed to water, then to the creek. She nodded again. For the next hour they communicated like this. He would point to a word, and she would nod or shake her head. She took the book from him and began to scan the pages herself, her finger tracing the strange English letters. She pointed to the word home. She looked at him, her expression a question. He put his hand over his heart, then swept it in a gesture that took in the small cabin, the barn, the whole valley. "Home," he said. He tapped his chest again. "My home." Then he looked at her and gently tapped her shoulder. "Your home," he added, "if you want it." Tears welled in her eyes. She quickly blinked them away, but not before he saw them. She closed the book and pushed it back toward him. Then, using her hands, she began to tell him a story. She made the shape of a boat on a rolling sea. She made the shape of a tall mountain of gold, then showed hands digging. A railroad. She pointed east toward Nevada, then made a gesture of a man signing a paper. She drew a snake in the air and pointed in the direction of town, leaving no doubt she meant Bishop. Finally, she held her hands as if they were bound. Caleb began to piece it together. San Francisco, the railroad, a debt, her father. Bishop hadn't won her. He had taken her as collateral on a debt her father couldn't pay, promising she would be safe until it was paid off. But Bishop was a snake. The poker game, it wasn't a whim. It was a performance. He had intended to lose her to one of his own men, a way to launder his ownership of her before selling her on. Caleb winning had ruined his plan. The red dress wasn't a mark of shame. It was her finest possession, worn with the desperate hope that her father would come for her. The dictionary was her tool, her weapon, her one link to this new, harsh world. A cold, hard anger settled deep in Caleb's bones. This wasn't about pride or a poker hand anymore. This was about justice. The next morning, the proof of Bishop's intentions arrived. 2 men rode up to his fence line, not on the main track, but from the direction of Bishop's mining interest to the north. They didn't come to the cabin. Instead, they began hammering posts into the ground, marking off a square of land that included the spring that fed Caleb's creek, his only source of water. Caleb grabbed his rifle from above the door and strode out to meet them. May was right behind him, her face a pale, set mask. "This is my land," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "You're on my claim." One of the men, a burly fellow with a week's worth of stubble, just laughed. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Not according to the territorial clerk in Harmony Creek, mister. Bishop filed a new claim on this spring yesterday. Perfectly legal. Says your original survey was in error." It was a lie, a blatant land grab, but one backed by a piece of paper and a corrupt official. He couldn't fight it here and now. Shooting them would only make him an outlaw. He stood there, helpless, as they finished their work and rode away, laughing. He looked at the new stakes, a fence of greed cutting through his life. He looked at May. She was watching him, her expression not of fear but of resolute strength. It gave him strength in return. He knew what he had to do. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. He went into the cabin and took down the small tin box where he kept his money. He had $40. It was everything he had in the world. "I have to ride out," he told May, pointing west, "to Carson City." He tried to explain with gestures. A man with a star, a telegraph wire. He didn't know if she understood, but she nodded anyway, her trust in him absolute. He packed his saddlebags with jerky and a canteen. Before he left, May pressed something into his hand. It was a small, intricately knotted charm made from red thread, a token of luck. He tucked it safely in his shirt pocket, the feel of it a small, warm spot against his chest. He rode west, not looking back, leaving everything he cared about undefended. He was putting his faith in a piece of wire, and the hope that somewhere, miles away, there was still such a thing as the law. 3 months passed. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The aspens in the high country turned a brilliant yellow, and a chill settled into the valley at night. Caleb's $40 had been just enough to send a detailed telegraph to the U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City and buy meager provisions for the ride home. Then came the waiting, the hardest part. Every day he expected to see Bishop and his men ride into the valley to claim the water. Every day he and May worked from sunup to sundown, shoring up the barn, putting up hay, and rounding up the few cattle that Bishop's men had scattered in a spiteful act of malice a week after he'd returned. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that needed few words. He taught her how to mend the fence post, and she taught him which wild plants were good for soup and which could soothe a fever. Her garden, once just a patch of herbs for healing, expanded. She grew greens and root vegetables that supplemented their meager diet. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Then, one afternoon, 2 riders appeared on the ridge. They weren't Bishop's men. They were tall, grim-faced men wearing the badges of U.S. Marshals. Caleb met them at the fence, his heart pounding. May stood on the porch, her hands clasped, watching. The Marshals had his telegraph. They had spent weeks quietly investigating Frank Bishop, not just his fraudulent land claim, but his entire operation. The debts he collected, the men he cheated, the bribes he paid. Bishop was gone, arrested and awaiting a federal judge. The territorial clerk in Harmony Creek was gone with him. The claim on Caleb's spring was null and void. When the Marshals left, a profound peace settled over the valley. The threat that had loomed over them for months had finally lifted. That evening, Caleb and May sat by the fire, the silence comfortable and deep. He watched the firelight play on her face. She had taken her plain red dress and altered it, adding panels of sturdy calico at the sides and hem to make it more suitable for ranch work. The vibrant red was still there, a bright, defiant thread woven into the fabric of their new life. He thought of the poker game, of the sneer on Bishop's face, the contempt in the eyes of the townsmen. They had seen a piece of property, a prize to be won. They had never seen the keen intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her capable hands, the quiet courage that had sustained her through it all. He had been just as blind at first, seeing only his own predicament, but she had shown him who she was, not with words, but with actions. He reached up to the mantelpiece and took down the small, worn dictionary. He turned the fragile pages, the book falling open to a page he had looked at many times. He walked over to her and held it out. His finger rested on a single word. Wife. He didn't say it aloud. He just looked at her, his heart in his eyes. It wasn't a demand or an expectation. It was a question, humbly asked. May looked at the word, then up at his weathered face. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her lips. She didn't need the book. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the open page. Then, with her other hand, she gently touched the red good luck charm he still carried in his shirt pocket. She simply nodded. In that moment, Caleb Hayes understood. He hadn't won anything in a saloon that night. He had been given a chance. A home is not a place you win, but a thing you build, piece by piece, with trust and respect as its foundation. And in the heart of the vast, lonely frontier, he had finally found his. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.